Hi guys, it's Dylan from Bijou Diamond Jewellery in London with another watch video, and today we're taking a look at the Zenith Defy Classic in titanium. As with all my reviews, let's go back in time now and take a look at the history of this watch. I'm just going to look at a very brief basic history of the Defy. We're going to go back to the 1960s, which is when the world was very much obsessed with futuristic technologies and looking to the future. 1969 is when we went to the moon. The 60s were full of excitement about what the future had to offer in technologies. Major emphasis on computers and space travel, and just generally looking to the future. And this trickled through to watchmaking as well, where there was the introduction of the quartz movement, which represented to the general public or watch enthusiasts definitely by far the future of watchmaking. To go from a mechanical movement to a quartz movement was in a way like going from an internal combustion engine car to an electric vehicle. It was a very futuristic and seemed to be the right thing to do. Quartz movements offered fantastic reliability, accuracy, and they could last for a very long time. The power reserve was years sometimes. So yeah, it was a fantastic upgrade really to the general public. So for that reason, the mechanical watch industry really suffered, and a lot of brands had to try and think of a way to bring back clients to the mechanical watches and make them more interesting, to try and tempt people back to the kind of old ways that mechanical movements were offering. So Zenith was one of these brands that tried to break through this struggle for mechanical watches during what was nicknamed the quartz crisis. And in 1969 they released the Zenith Defy. The Defy really in essence is exactly as its name describes. It was designed to be totally different to the rest of the collection, totally different to anything out there at the time. It was defying all kind of sports watch or high-end sports watch standards of the 1960s. And actually it was a major trendsetter. It was a watch in some respects that was so ahead of its time. I mean, a few years later on, obviously we saw the Royal Oak Extra Thin, the Overseas, we saw the Nautilus, all from basically the Gerald Genta series of watches. And they were, in many respects, very similar to what Zenith had released in the Defy. But the Defy just didn't have quite the same success as those other brands. So the Defy that Zenith released in 1969 was the reference 3 or A3642. And it was a really interesting looking watch, very faceted and shaped very interesting, very angular, incredibly unique looking compared to most of the dress watches that we were seeing at that time, or very plain sports watches like the Submariner. The watch was also relatively groundbreaking in terms of technology as well. It also featured a 600-meter water resistance on some of the models, or variations of the Defy when it was first released, which was almost unheard of at the time. It was a very high water resistance, especially from a brand that really wasn't focusing on dive watches necessarily. But when it was released, it wasn't particularly popular at all. Maybe that's as a result of its incredibly bold looks and defiant design. Quite a few different variations of the Zenith Defy were released over the years. It wasn't really until the mid-2000s though that we saw a model that really changed the Defy line forever and really put it on the map in terms of Swiss watchmaking properly. And that was the Defy Extreme. And the Defy Extreme came at the perfect time. It was a big watch on a bracelet, and it was just a bulky design basically when it was first released. A very bold looking timepiece, and it was at the time where pop culture was definitely looking at basically showing their wealth, and one of the ways to do that was through expensive large watches, and therefore the demand for larger watches grew massively, as that really was the way for people to be able to show off their wealth. And the Zenith Defy Extreme was exactly that. It was a way to show off your wealth, and with a large, bold case design, skeletonized dial. It was a, very high-end looking watch in a large case size. So it did much better from that point onwards, and it definitely put the Defy back on the map in terms of the Zenith collection. Over the following next few years, Zenith released many different variations of the Defy, some really incredible limited editions and some fantastic feats of watchmaking with some incredible tourbillons as well. Some very, very beautiful zero-G watches. Some of the most beautiful watches I think in the watch industry that are often overlooked are actually from the Defy collection from Zenith. And actually what's quite special was this year in 2022, as a celebration of the original Defy, Zenith revamped the original Defy and released it as a brand new model. And it's actually one of the best revamps or revisits to an original model that I've ever seen from a brand, apart from maybe AP with the extra thin, which has stayed true for almost forever. This revamp has been so true to the original, which is fantastic. Often brands change many things and make them look just a little bit similar to the original. This is so true to the original, and it's just amazing to see. It's really funny. It's kind of almost weird, I'm sure, for any collectors that actually own the original Defy. But yeah, that concludes the history of the Defy. That's just a basic history, but let's move on now to the features. We're taking a look at the Defy Classic today in the 41mm case size with a titanium bracelet and titanium case. And it's got this amazing skeletonized classic Defy dial as well, which is just really cool looking. We'll start with the clasp as always. The clasp on this watch is a double deployment clasp. It is a really, really nice clasp. It is very, very solid feeling. One thing that is frustrating about this clasp though is that it doesn't have any adjustability, which is, not the fault of just this Defy clasp, on its own. It's actually a general problem with most deployment clasps or twin deployment clasps, that you are not unable to adjust the bracelet, making it bigger or smaller. So in the summer, when your wrist expands a little bit, this watch can become very, very tight, and there's not really much you can do other than adding a link in, which is a bit tedious sometimes. So yeah, that would be my one complaint about double deployment clasp, but again, not specifically aimed at this clasp alone. It is very nicely finished. I like the way it obviously blends into the bracelet. That is always a nice feature about twin deployment clasps. Moving on to our bracelet now, we've got a nice bracelet. It's relatively simple in its finishing. It is slightly more complex in its actual design. It definitely feels slightly more rugged, a bit more like a tag style bracelet than maybe we see on the Carrera or some Carrera watches. We see a similar bracelet to this on those watches, but it is nice. There are features of this bracelet that definitely makes it feel much higher end than its price point. One complaint I have about the bracelet though is that it is really annoying to adjust. Something that I don't understand why some brands do is when they have the twin or the dual screw system for each link. That just makes it a little bit more difficult to adjust the bracelet for our clients. I think the bracelet does definitely have a weird kind of strange mix between intricacy and kind of utilitarian feel. It feels very rugged on one hand, but also feels like it's trying to be more intricate on the other hand. It's like this awkward middle point. It kind of needs just something slightly different about it, maybe thinned out a little bit, and it would be more towards the intricate side. Moving on to the case. The case on this watch is also an interesting mix of intricacy and kind of utilitarian feel. It is nicely finished on the whole. It does look relatively simple in some respects, but it is really, really nice. I like the way they've polished the bezel and polished certain beveled edges on the watch. It definitely gives this watch some interesting lines, but it is flatter in some parts that I think it could have had a bit more angle to it. More reminiscent maybe of the original Defy would have been perhaps more interesting if it was slightly more bolder like that and used a more interesting mix of polished and brushed finishes like the original Defy did. I think that would make it more interesting, but it is a really beautiful classic case, and I think when you put it on a strap, the case really comes to life and you really appreciate how beautiful the case actually can look. In a way, it sometimes feels like it's fighting with the bracelet to really come out and come to life almost. You can see that the finishing on the case is definitely a machined finished product. It doesn't feel quite as kind of finessed and detailed in its finishing compared to an Audemars Piguet or a Patek Philippe, but of course we're talking about, in some respects, 100 times the price of this watch. So you are definitely getting a lot for your money in terms of finishing on this watch. You can maybe if you did own an AP as well as this watch, you would definitely be able to tell the difference between the two in terms of the standard and the quality. The actual case size of the watch is 41 millimeters. It doesn't feel too big though. It feels more like a 42 mil maybe than a 41, but it doesn't feel over-facing at all. It definitely sits on the wrist really nicely. I think perhaps that might be to do with the depth of the watch, that it feels maybe slightly larger than that. But nonetheless, really nice. I would have loved to have seen this in a 39 millimeter case size. I think that would look absolutely brilliant. I think also the bracelet definitely enlarges the size of this watch. I think if you wear it on a strap, it definitely feels like more close to its 41 millimeter case size. Moving on to the case back before we look at the dial and the rest of the watch. The case back is a clear crystal case back, which is always amazing to have. And the case back reveals this really interesting star designed rotor, which I really love. It's great movement. It's got fantastic power reserve as well. And yeah, it's just really cool looking. I think it's really interesting the way they've done that star-shaped rotor. I think that's really unique, and I like to see brands doing something where it really sets them apart from others. Not only is that fantastic and interesting looking in terms of design, but in terms of engineering to make that rotor work still and be functional is really, really cool. Moving on to our dial now, we have a fantastic looking titanium-y kind of grey skeletonized dial, which is just so cool looking. I mean, really, you're only getting a dial this good looking on an AP open worked, and again, like I said, that's kind of 100 times the price for a comparable watch. The dial also features this amazing set of bridges or structure to hold the movement that is in the same star style shape, which obviously is from the Zenith logo. Even that is so creative how they've done that. It's so clever. I think it's really beautiful in a way because they've maintained a really wonderful symmetry across the dial, which not many brands do when it comes to open worked watches or skeletonized dials. Often it looks or can look slightly messy. I love the way that the date wheel even is open and you can see it all the way around the dial, and that itself is also suspended on this kind of star design as well, which is really interesting looking. Very beautiful, very clever how they've done that, and I love that way that the actual date window itself is sitting down at 6 o'clock, nice and symmetrical, very legible. Another thing I love about this dial is the blue ring around the edge or the outer ring of the dial. It's just such a really pretty touch to this watch, and it ties in so well to the kind of dark grey look of the titanium and the actual dial itself. The blue is slightly greyed off, which looks really nice as well. And the index markers are all tied into this blue section. It kind of feels as if it's a little step above the rest of the dial, and those little index markers are almost like diving boards that you just fall off this edge of the, this kind of rim of the swimming pool into this deep pit of incredible parts and movement beneath or below it. So yeah, really beautiful. I love the way they designed the balance of that part of the dial. It looks fantastic. So that concludes our features of this watch. Let's take a look at whether or not I would own it and my general opinions of this watch. Overall, I think this is one of the best buys you could get for this price point, if not the best buy you could get for this price point. Comparable watches in this price point or this price bracket are watches like the Tag Carrera. Certain Carrera models feature very similar looking design to this, but for me, they are nowhere near as beautiful as this watch. This watch has the design cues and design style and finesse in some respects of Audemars Piguet and much higher end brands. Obviously, Zenith is very well respected in the watch industry, even by connoisseurs and collectors that collect the top end of the watch industry. Zenith is still to this day quite a respected brand. And like I said a couple of times, the AP open worked watches, some of them are 100 times the price of this watch. So you're getting so much watch for the money in terms of this piece being around the £5,000 mark. Definitely a fantastic buy. No matter what you have in your collection, whether this is your first watch or your 20th watch, it is a great piece. And there are loads of watches in the Defy collection that you can look at. Personally, I think the Defy Classic is the best in the collection because it's slightly smaller, looks more classic and just, well, it is named classic, just looks a bit more pretty. I would love it if they made it in a 39mm case size, but nonetheless, it still fits really nicely on my wrist, which is 16.5 centimeters in circumference. I personally would own this variation over any of the others. This titanium one I think is fantastic looking with that blue kind of or little ring around the edge of the dial. I personally would put it on a strap though. They do offer this watch with a blue strap which matches nicely with the blue ring. I would pair it with one of our grey Perlon straps. I think that would look absolutely fantastic. Thanks guys for watching. Let us know in the comments what you think of this Zenith Defy Classic. Would you own this classic, or would you own another classic, or would you own another watch in the Defy collection? Or perhaps you would own a whole different watch altogether. Let us know in the comments what you think of this piece. And as always, if you're interested in this watch or any other watch in the Zenith collection, then don't hesitate to contact us. Our details are in the description, and also at the end of the video. It'd be a pleasure to call this watch into stock for you.